Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. I'm your host, Nick, and today we are going to jump into a news recap from this time that I've been out sick. Oh my goodness, it has not been fun. It's been a lot of cold symptoms, and I could not produce a high quality show just between the coughing, the sniffling, and just, all the phlegm. Not a good time. I don't recommend it. Stay healthy and take your vitamins, kids, all right? But on a serious note, I'm going to be doing this episode a little bit differently from the ones past. But in this episode, I want to talk about recent events, but using a theme that kind of ties it all together. I'm going to try out the new format and see how it goes. So for this week, we are starting since when we left off on September 30th, okay? September 30th, 2025 through now. So the first event that went down is the government shutdown. So what does that mean? Well, the government is officially not funded through the next part of the fiscal year. Now, as of October 1st, 2025, the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress were not able to negotiate a clean resolution that would allow the United States government to be funded. So, hold that thought. In terms of the government shutdown, right? The topic we're going to be using for today's episode is accountability. Now, you'll notice throughout the series of these political events, accountability will be at the core of each of them. So before I jump back into the government shutdown, let's try to review, what does accountability mean? So what does it mean to hold someone accountable? You've probably heard that a million times, but in this particular context, with government accountability, it really does mean holding someone or an entity, such as an elected official or a government agency or a nonprofit group, right? Holding someone or an entity responsible for their actions. It's all about responsibility. Now, this is a way to not only take ownership in actions that they've done that may have been, let's say, inappropriate, unsatisfactory, or just plainly just didn't meet expectations. So with that said, we want to make sure that the entity or the individual or whatnot, they are, not only showing their trust with the public, but they're also, doing things that are good and noble. And then holding them accountable will keep them on track. That's ideally why we hold someone accountable. Now, the steps that go through that, right? This is a way for us to reassess expectations. Again, if they're acting out of line or doing something that we don't like, this will reevaluate maybe what their way of thinking was. And the best way we do that is through feedback, right? So the public, our feedback comes across on social media through, someone calling into a radio station, comes in through, people just like protesting even, right? Protest is a form of accountability. So with all these different actions, there are ways that the public can give their feedback on these perceived actions. And then that would also require the elected official or the entity or the group to then share, why they made this decision, why this action came about, or basically why this way of thinking led them to these actions. So ideally, out of that, right, we want to then see a set of either results or consequences. Will they learn from their mistake? Which would lead to a positive result. That would be great. That would be a win-win situation. But many times in politics, this is what sows distrust from the government, is that when we try to hold them accountable, they generally don't follow through, and the result is negative. So there's usually a negative consequence, such as more protesting, or, when applicable, withholding our vote because clearly this elected official did not earn it. Or the entity, right, if they're fundraising, we withhold our dollars because they are not worth us giving our money to promote their bad actions. So you can see how holding, someone or something accountable can lead to positive or negative results, but ideally it's to encourage or inform or guide a better set of actions or responses, right? Based on something, again, that we found satisfactory or didn't align with our expectations. And then lastly, right, at the end of the day, after all is said and done, we want to keep an open dialogue so that both parties, right, the public and the people in charge, they are not only helping us achieve a common goal, right? Let's say we want better climate, right? What are they doing to create better climate policy? Whether that's through bills, whether that's through, funding certain projects, right? So many different ways to do that. And then even if it's more about just, measurable results, how can we see that they're trying to achieve that goal? Is it through X amount of funding through some sort in bill? Is it, how many legislators or, let's say key decision makers or figureheads that people were able to rally behind, certain number of people showing support of a certain issue or action? These are all ways that we can, pretty much come out of an accountability moment stronger, more aligned, and creating that trust that is just so broken right now between the government and the public. So, holding people accountable and entities accountable can be a force for good. So, I strongly encourage folks to hold people accountable as long as it's responsible, not causing harm, and ideally, it's a win-win situation where everyone should be aligned to achieve a common goal. Okay, and back to the government shutdown. Now, what's happening here since October 1st, the United States government has not been open. Essentially, what's happened is that a clean resolution that would fund the government through the next short-term period has not been agreed upon by Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats. Now, there are 53 Republicans where 3 Democrats sided with them to vote for a clean resolution. However, with this bill in particular, as we know with most votes in the Senate, there is a 60 vote threshold, meaning 60 senators must vote for a bill in order for it to pass the Senate. Now, in this particular case, there are still 4 votes needed in order to pass the bill. Now, why would Democrats withhold their vote? In this particular case, this is one of the few good moves that Democrats, led by Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, are actually, really holding the line. This is all to save the ACA subsidies. The Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, will allow for those subsidies to keep healthcare premium costs lower. Now, this was already granted to the American public in 2 previous bills. First, in 2021, when Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act. All right? And that first lowered the ACA subsidies, or that first lowered healthcare premium costs with the subsidies. Now, in 2022, a year later, Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which extended those subsidy credits into at least 3 more years. And here we are, 2025. Now you can imagine, Biden probably imagined if he ran for re-election, he would easily extend those subsidies again. But we all know how that election turned out, so that ain't happening. So now we're left to the Senate Democrats to hold the line to make sure that healthcare costs remain low for millions of Americans, especially those who buy off the marketplace for the Affordable Care Act. Now, in this instance, we are seeing how Republicans are now countering or trying to pressure Democrats into getting their votes by claiming that they want to spend trillions of dollars on free health care for immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. Sounds like a bold claim, but we know that it is not based in truth. A study was done recently that showed in 2022, out of all the Medicaid spending on undocumented immigrants, it came down to 0.4%. That is very little. That is barely anything, less than 1%, okay, of healthcare for Medicaid spent on undocumented immigrants. Now, why would we spend money on undocumented immigrants? Well, let's remind the Republicans that in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, okay? And this was passed under the Consolidated Omnibus Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as COBRA. So the fact that this bill was signed by Republican favorite Ronald Reagan back in the 80s, okay? So this isn't new. Like, it's technically older than I've been alive, technically. So that's how old it is, okay? But that being said, Republicans know that this law exists, signed by their guy. So, like, they're pretending that, like, oh my gosh, we're going to spend money on undocumented immigrants. It's like, bruh, that's been the law since your guy signed it in 1986. Are you for real right now? So, like, can you imagine? They're like harping on this issue, knowing very well that it is already part of the law. Now, just to be clear, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act mandates that any hospital that receives Medicare or Medicaid funding from the federal government must give emergency care to anyone who needs it, right? So regardless if they can pay or if their ethnicity, their race, right, they cannot be discriminated against, and they must receive a comparable, decent level of emergency care. Now, if by the small chance that that hospital does not receive federal funding, then they must transfer that patient to a hospital that does. And then the other hospital must receive that patient no matter what. So it's already in the governmental system. Like, we're already doing this. So the fact that Republicans are harping on this issue it's disingenuous, it's not okay, right? And it's quite disgusting because they know very well that they are lying about the actual situation in our healthcare system. So, coming to accountability, I highly recommend that anyone out there, number one, call your representative, call your senator to demand that they put the ACA subsidy funding back into the funding bill. Number two, if you have a Republican member of Congress or a Republican senator who is up for re-election in 2026, you can hold them accountable because these actions are gross, right? Hold them accountable because they were playing with people's lives. So or for you, right? If your health care is going to go up by hundreds, if not thousands of dollars because they refuse to put those ACA subsidies back in the funding bill, then they did not earn your vote. You should withhold your vote and not vote for your Republican member of Congress, whether if they are in the House or the Senate and up for re-election in 2026. Do not vote for them because they do not deserve it. That is how we hold people accountable. That is how we force actions that could be for the greater good. And one last tidbit on that study that was done, the fact that the study showed that out of 38 states and Washington, D.C., again, we spent 0.4% on Medicaid funding toward undocumented immigrants. Do you know how much we spent per undocumented immigrant? Less than $10. It was like $9 and like 30 something cents. So less than $10. A cocktail in New York City is more expensive than how much the United States government through Medicaid spent on undocumented immigrants in 2022. So don't tell me that that it's too much funding or that Republicans can't afford it. They know what they're doing, they're lying to you and to all of us, and they must be held accountable. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And you can not only follow me on Instagram, but now you can also follow me on TikTok. And you can follow, both handles are the same. So you can follow on Instagram or on TikTok at NSFD_pod. Now, speaking of holding people accountable, Letitia James, she is New York State's Attorney General who has done a fabulous job holding President Trump and his business empire accountable for fraud. Now, since Tish James was first elected as New York State Attorney General in 2018, she has made it a mission to hold people in power accountable. She has done so with former Governor Cuomo. He was charged with sexual assault allegations across several women in his office in New York State. In addition, she has also held the Trump organization, right, Trump's business empire, accountable because they are liable for fraud. So in that particular case, right, we know with this guy, with Trump, right, was he responsible for his actions? He never is. Was there ever a sense of open dialogue where he could share his feedback? He was just attacking Tish James the whole time. Again, what was the explanation? Nothing. What was the the feedback? Again, there's no chance for an open dialogue. He just countersued. And then lastly, right, what is the common goal? It is to promote good business practices. No matter how powerful you are, you have to play by the rules because everybody knows no one is above the law. Trump thinks he is, and here we are. So, with all that said, now President Trump is going after Tish James. Now, mind you, this is over something that's pretty bogus, right? But again, it's all about holding people accountable. In 2020, Tish James had bought a house in Norfolk, Virginia for $137,000. Now, with that hefty sum of money, right, there was a mortgage loan that was granted to, at the time, the New York Attorney General, Tish James, in order to buy the house. Now, in order to receive that loan, she had to be clear on what she was using that loan for. Now, in this particular case, with that house, I think with the way the rules were set with the loan is that she would have to live on the residence for 1 full year. Then she could do whatever she wanted with the property. Now, at the time, Tish James was renting it out. It was her. She owned it, so she could essentially do what she wanted, but she could only do what she wanted after that 1 year time of living on the residence. Now, we know the New York Attorney General was not going to be living in Norfolk, Virginia, but she also knows that filing the paperwork can be tricky. So in this particular case, was she honest? Did she lie? I don't think she would have lied because she knows the risk and the gamble. But in this case, by not living at the residence for a year, right, she had taken that slightly lower loan, right, which if she took the full loan would have been slightly higher. It would have been $19,000 she would have had to pay over the whole span of the loan. So basically, it's like, did she or did she not? I don't think she did. I don't think there's any wrongdoing this because if anyone here in New York has gotten to meet Tish James, knows her, sees the work she does, she is a woman of character. She is a woman who definitely knows right from wrong, and she has been fighting for the working class since day one. So do I think she took advantage of this system? No. Do I think that Trump is in the wrong? Yes. And do I think, whatever the paperwork shows, I really think like with the convoluted, burdensome process of all this, like if there was a mistake in there, I wouldn't be surprised because at the end of the day, it's like no one really teaches you how to do this stuff. So I would strongly recommend that we think that Tish James is innocent until proven guilty. Now, if you remember, only a few weeks ago, the federal prosecutor who was originally going to indict Tish James on these charges did not. Why? Number one, because there's no evidence of wrongdoing. So he didn't. And two, the person resigned. Why would this person resign? Because there was pressure from Trump's DOJ and Trump himself to create this false charge against Tish James. So right then and there, if the federal prosecutor already found no evidence of wrongdoing only weeks ago, then the guy that Trump handpicked for this case is not acting in good faith. But unfortunately, because Trump is in control of the federal government, there is no way to actually hold the federal prosecutor accountable because all the levers of power are within Trump's hands, between owning or being in control of the Department of Justice. They're supposed to act independently, but we know that with Pam Bondi and everyone else at the DOJ, it's not going to happen. Trump is the president of the United States. He is the leader of the executive branch, right? And then lastly, we know that Trump has a very clear vendetta against Tish James. She charged him for fraud successfully, so now he's fighting back in revenge with her in a fraud case. So you can just see how it's disingenuous from the start. And at the end of the day, it's just bad blood from Trump. We know he's not acting in good faith. So for anyone to think otherwise, it's just all signs point to yes, she's innocent. But Trump doesn't want that because he knows he's trying to get back at her for her actually doing her job as New York State Attorney General. So it's a real shame. So solidarity to Tish James. There was a rally here in New York City on Friday. There's a big turnout. Even Zohran Mamdani, New York City's Democratic nominee for mayor, was there, and he led a really good chant and had a great speech in support of Letitia James, New York State Attorney General. So it's really reassuring to see that as a Democratic nominee, Zohran is coming out swinging for the Democrats, all right? So for anyone who thought, oh, he's DSA, Democratic Socialist, it's like, well, yes, but he's also a team player. Yes, he also knows right from wrong. Yes, he has good moral character. Yes, he does want the best for our city and our state. And Tish James, she's been in New York City politics for so long. She was a part of the Working Families Party before it was cool. So the fact that she is now under attack from Trump, Kathy Hochul said it best. I criticize her a lot, but Governor Hocul said, if you come for her, you come for all of us, meaning New Yorkers. And she's right. Full solidarity with Tish James. She is in the right here, and we must support her because we cannot let Trump attack our city and our elected officials, knowing when they're doing a good job and holding people accountable. Now, for the last example of holding people accountable comes from former Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, she has been on her book tour for her memoir, 107 Days, in New York City, Washington, D.C., and as of recently, as of October 11th, Chicago. So now she's the former vice president. Now she's a private citizen. And on this book tour in Chicago, again, there were more protesters at this book event. Now, they had erupted in the middle of the event. And at this time, though, and she's been doing this more recently, she actually spoke back, not in the way that she did back in when she was on the campaign trail, but she's actually speaking back in a way where she stands up for herself. This isn't necessarily what we would expect from Harris, who, gave a more polished version of speaking to protesters. But in this version, it came off more authentic. It came across as authoritative, as a sign of strength. Because again, she was the former vice president of the United States. That is a very powerful position. And lastly, after, now that she's not beholden to, public office, she is just beholden to her own self as a, reputable woman. A half black, half Asian woman who has navigated the halls of Congress to the White House to getting so close to the breaking that glass ceiling. So you know what? Good for you, Kamala Harris. You deserve to stand up for yourself after everything that's been going on. Now, the protester, which is there's been a series of them across the the book tour, and many of them have come from an organization called Code Pink. Now, Code Pink, I'm going to give a shout out to Code Pink. Code Pink does good work. They are a feminist grassroots organization that holds people and other groups accountable to take down our imperialist, militaristic structures, but also fighting for progressive, left-leaning policies. So they are doing good work. Now, the difference here is while I commend them for their mission, I commend them for many of their tactics, I have to say in this instance where I believe it was a young black woman who, interjected and interrupted some of the earlier book tour events, right, who was from Code Pink, the time and the space, I don't support it. I don't think it was a good move. Why? Well, number one, when Harris or any public figure is holding, a book signing, book tour, whatever you want to call it, right? There's so many different intimate events where their supporters come to see you. They're responsible for the safety and security of the people in the audience. They're also trying to create a safe space. So if these protesters, yes, they have every right to be angry about how the U.S. is funding military operations around the world and how our tax dollars are spent in the most horrifying ways. But to do it while interrupting that safe space and putting, people's security at risk, it's not a really good move. And it doesn't necessarily send the right message, where their intended message is one thing, but what gets communicated through the optics doesn't read well. And I know there's people out there who think they did the right thing. It's noble, right? Code Pink, they should do it all the time, blah, blah, blah. They have every right to. Protest, they're allowed to. I personally think this is not the right time or place, right? They had plenty of time to do it when Harris was on the campaign trail. They had plenty of time to do it when she was in the White House. But at this particular moment on a book tour, when people in the room support Harris, right? Them really shifting the energy. It doesn't bode well for the people in the room. Like, it's not going to bring them onto their side. It's not going to necessarily open their eyes to the mission in the way they want, right? So, like, I just think it was more of a miss for Code Pink than a win, because I see it more as like content creation rather than activism, right? Because everyone in that room, they're not really going to agree with Code Pink is doing. They may agree with the mission, but not the tactics. And then lastly, like, the people outside the room, right? The folks that are online on social media, they're the ones liking, reposting, and sharing the videos of this instance. So for them, they're like, oh, this is great. But that just serves content creation purposes, right? The video and the action of her doing it, and Code Pink getting the publicity of like people talking about it, right? It's about content creation more than actual activism. Like, yes, activism can be a force for good. I've been an activist myself. I think it can be done well and effective. I just don't see this being effective, especially when the people in charge right now are Republicans in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and the White House. And moreover, this was done where Harris is a private citizen. She doesn't have the same type of power she once did. Granted, she always will be the former vice president. And accountability, this is where the question comes into play. Were the Code Pink protesters, and anyone who's protested Harris at the book tour specifically, anyone who's protested Harris at her 107 days book tour stops, is that holding her accountable? I would love to hear from everyone, right? Do you think that's holding her accountable? Let me know on social media. Let me know in the Facebook comments. Let me know, right? Like, if you're one of my friends who I know personally, like, we can chat about it in person. I'm not inviting random people on the street to go, like, harass me. Like, that's definitely not what I'm doing, because, again, there's a time and a place, right? But I'd be very curious to hear, because I personally think it was more content creation than actual activism, especially since I don't find it effective. I do think Harris not being in office now, like, holding her accountable for her actions, like, what's the time limit? Is she going to be held accountable, like, for the rest of her life? Is she going to do it for the rest of the book tour? Like, hey, if she decides to run for president in 2028, which we know she will, then that is a great time to hold her accountable. But at this time, I think it just reads wrong. So you know what? I will give Harris credit, because one of the comments she made was saying how, oh, like, for the protesters, she's like, go protest the White House. That's my point exactly. Harris is not in the White House. Go protest Trump and the Republicans. But moreover, she then goes, on Saturday, October 11th, in Chicago, she goes, were you one of the people demanding we don't vote? It's a great response. It challenges the notion that just because you want to hold someone accountable and withhold your vote, like, it can be a force for good to force them to change their actions. But we saw what happened because people withheld their vote. We now have probably the most evil president in modern history occupying the White House, who is ready to usurp power, possibly cancel elections, and really turn our democracy into an authoritarian regime. All because people wanted to hold her accountable. It's a controversial topic. Holding people accountable can obviously extend beyond this podcast, but it's a very interesting way on how we encourage people to do good and how there's open dialogue to achieve a common goal. And I think the results or consequences, right? We could look at it both ways, but I would strongly encourage you to think about what's the best way you could hold someone accountable, and what's the best way we can achieve those common goals together. Because at the end of the day, holding people accountable, that is good for democracy. But what Trump is doing and the way he's going after his people who have tried to hold him accountable through vengeance and revenge, now that is not suitable for democracy. And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in to Not Suitable for Democracy. Now, this was episode 21, and we've got 2 more episodes coming out this week. We've got to play a little catch-up since I was out last week, but you know what? I think you're going to like what we have in store. So that means you need to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Also, don't forget to follow on Instagram and TikTok. Yes, we are now on TikTok, the same handle used for both. so you can follow me at NSFD_pod. I hope you learned a little more about holding people accountable, and at the end of the day, democracy is not suitable without you.